Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, oil has been dominating the headlines this week. Is the world's dependence on Middle East supplies dwindling, and are big corporations learning from their past mistakes? And Black British Women will be celebrated at an illustrious awards ceremony next month. Is the power of the black female pound finally getting the recognition it deserves? Before those discussions, here is some business news from across the globe. Tourists hoping to catch a view of Kuala Lumpur's famed skyline were left disappointed this week as smoke from forest fires in neighbouring Indonesia shrouded the Malaysian capital. The Petronas Twin Towers were barely visible from the Kuala Lumpur Tower skydeck, where thousands of visitors go to enjoy panoramic views of the city.
We haven't booked Petronas Towers yet, but we were going to do it. But Malaysia's a country, I like it. It's really nice, really friendly people. Food is very nice. But I'm just quite disappointed with the views up here, to be honest.
The Solomon Islands government has voted to cut official ties with Taiwan. The Pacific nation's decision followed a months-long review of the pros and cons of a switch to Beijing, which was offering $8.5 million in development funds. The switch is a huge gain for China in its campaign to secure allies from self-ruled and democratic Taiwan, a region that Beijing considers a wayward Chinese province with no right to state-to-state ties. Finance ministers from the European Union are considering new energy taxes to meet climate targets. Over the past decade, the EU have led a global shift towards renewable energy. However, the bloc's rules on taxation have not changed for more than 15 years.
We are finance ministers. We have a key responsibility to fight against climate change, because we should really provide the necessary funding for fighting against climate change. We need a green finance, and we need to have our own European values, our own European taxonomy, to be sure that the finance is helping us to fight against climate change.
Mexico's foreign ministry has urged the French auction house Milan to halt what it has called an illegal auction of 120 pieces of pre-Columbian artifacts. The foreign ministry said in a statement that some of the pieces appear to have been stolen or illegally sold, while others may not be authentic. The tensions over the art pieces come amid a wider discussion over whether Western collectors and museums should return objects to their countries of origin. Representatives from Milan Auction House say the auction satisfied all the legal criteria to justify their ownership of the collection. Attorney generals from Massachusetts and New York have vowed to oppose Purdue Pharma's bankruptcy appeal. The embattled maker of the OxyContin painkiller is seeking approval of a roughly $10 billion settlement stemming from the opioid crisis it helped to start. Almost every state across America has sued Purdue, and in some cases it's controlling Sackler family.
Purdue's position is that we need to resolve this all now in bankruptcy because it's important for the company to avoid, quote, the swamp of litigation. Well, we've had a swamp of funerals and heartache here and all over this country for many years now, and it is exactly why litigation is necessary.
Now over to the first of this week's discussions. Oil has dominated the headlines this week following attacks at two oil facilities belonging to the Saudi Arabian company Aramco. The attacks cut world crude oil production by 5% and sent oil prices soaring. Some analysts suggest that it could take up to 12 months for production to return to full capacity. The attack has potentially changed oil diplomacy for a generation.
This is the most important incident in the war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and it will reduce the Saudi production for at least a year. It will limit its capacity to use oil as a weapon, and it will actually benefit countries like the United States, Russia, and Iran, the oil producer, and Canada, because now oil is harder to get.
Joining me to discuss this is oil and conflict specialist Irene Gerlach. With these attacks, when you first heard about them, what were your initial thoughts?
I think that we've got to start to really seriously think about other sources of energy, and who's to say that another attack won't take place? I've noticed that the oil price has now gone back down, the price of crude, and that's because there are a lot of other that can produce and supply There have been rumours that possibly Brazil will come on more with the production to fill that gap. So, but it's unstable. Oil has always been unstable. But it is interesting times to see what actually will happen.
It's interesting you talk about Brazil, because that was really one of the main things I wanted to discuss today, because of course, you know, you've had America come out and saying, you know, we've got reserves, we are really the largest oil producer in the world.
Absolutely.
We're not relying on the Saudis, which some would say is one of the reasons why the prices have stabilised. But do you think that people are slowly moving away from the Middle East?
Yes, I do. I think because of all the crisis in the Middle East, since the start of the Iraq War actually, I think more and more countries are moving away from that and looking to other sources of oil. And as we know that the US anyway get 40% of its oil from Nigeria because of the type of crude that it gets. So I think that, there will be less of a dependence on the Middle East. Yeah.
You talk about Nigeria, we've got to talk about Africa, because Kenya, you know, they're the latest African country to discover oil. We covered it on this show, and there were flags, you know, at the port waving goodbye to the oil. But some people have warned Kenya and the Kenyan President Kenyatta by saying, look, you know, it may be seen as a blessing, but oil, in actual fact, can be such a curse. Do you understand why some African nations would have that sentiment?
Absolutely. I mean, Nigeria and its people have never benefited from the oil.
Well, its people, yes. Some Nigerians?
Yeah, so a few Nigerians have, and the oil companies have. But the majority of people live in abject poverty, and we know that in the Niger Delta. And all it's caused is conflict. If you look at Angola, the same scenario there. If you look at Sudan, the same scenario there. So when people say, well, we found oil, I think that isn't a blessing at all. And the problem is that when it dominates the economy, like it does in Nigeria, it means that there's no diversification of the economy. So everything is dependent on that oil. And I think it's very, very detrimental to the economy of that country, and people just will not benefit.
But that's not the case in the north of this country where we are in Britain. That hasn't been the case in some places. No,
it hasn't. And
in some places in America, and
exactly. Saudi.
What's unique about Africa and oil?
I think part of it is corruption. But it's not just corruption, because there's corruption in other places that's it. But I think that there's a feeling that with regard to Africa, that the companies have a different response towards Africa, that they feel that they don't really have to invest in it, that they can just plunder and take the resources. Now, if you mention, like you talked about the North of England, you talked about Shetland, for example, they have a fund that was set up for all of that community. And Shetland is relatively wealthy because at that time the people got together when they were negotiating all the contracts with the oil companies and said, you will treat us equally and no oil company will play one off against the other. So now, this does not happen in places like Nigeria or Angola. And I also think that the issue about Nigeria and other African states is that democracy is relatively new. When you look at it in terms of, like, you know, when really it came about was in the
Western
1960s.
democracy.
Western democracy. Yeah, the Eurosceptic democracy that, you know, whatever. But I think that it's still relatively new and growing. Unfortunately, it's got so many resources. I mean, it's not just oil. That's, if you look in the Congo, we've got problems of
DRC, which should be, yes,
exactly.
It should be the richest country on earth.
And I think also there is a lot of ethnic divisions, and oil companies and governments play into that.
It's interesting you say that, because my next question was going to be, can we just blame the oil companies? Let me give you this fact. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, they noted between 1997 and 2002, $4.2 billion literally disappeared from Angolan oil revenue. And the entire budget for Angola's social services, medical, education and other social services was $4.27 billion. That's not corruption, that's theft, isn't it? CSR may play a role.
This is a completely different form. You know, you can have corruption, right, but you can still invest in your economy. You can still invest in your people. Indonesia is a case in point. It really invested in its people, but there was still mass corruption. The problem is this is plunder. This is actually just taking all the resources. So no, we can't just blame the oil companies, it's governments. And also, people have to come together to fight this and not play along the ethnic lines that so divide countries. You know, people have to speak with one voice against the oil companies.
Do you not think that's been a case in the Niger Delta of people coming together?
I think they are, but I still think that there are issues around ethnicity and all of those things that do get played out. And of course, companies love that. If they can play one community off against another community, it's divide and rule. I think that is coming about slowly. But there still isn't the development in the Niger Delta that there should be.
Of course, of course. I think all of our viewers will agree with you on that. What about oil diplomacy? Because now, of course, you know, people are more aware, aren't they? You know, the big corporations are getting away with it, but it's not that easy to get away with, you know, causing, you know, complete spillages across the world, especially because we're trying to be cleaner, aren't we? You know, energy should be cleaner, and we're pushing away from destroying the oceans. Can African countries benefit from that, or are they only going to be affected by that?
No,
if they depend so much on oil.
I think they can benefit, and I think, you know, for instance, what happened in Bodo, and they took Shell to court, and they have to now pay up 55 million. I know that those communities still have not got that money, but, you know, it means that oil companies, energy companies, resource companies, any type of resource, if they do violate human rights, if they violate the environment, they can be taken to court. And it's a lot different to what it used to be. So they can't get away with it. I think what's more alarming is actually some of the small oil companies who can go under the radar and do some, you know, quite destructive, because they're not really accountable. They have very small shareholdings and all of that.
Well, they're making a lot of money, aren't they?
Exactly. So I think that's a bit of a worry, but I still think that, yes, I think oil companies have to improve, energy companies have to improve, because I think there's a recognition now that they're not going to get away with it.
Let me just quickly, before we wrap up, bring it back to what happened over the weekend with Aramco and Saudi Arabia. For once, oil seemed to be, you know, mentioned in the same sentence as war. You hadn't really, or for those of us that aren't savvy in that industry, heard that, you know, relationship before. Some even say that part of the war that's going on in Libya is because of the fight over oil.
Yes, it is about oil.
Even though there are some people that may have known that, it's slowly becoming regular in the mainstream, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I mean, if you take Iraq and the invasion of Iraq, was it about regime change or was it about control of the oil? You know, so it's all of that, and oil drives the world at the moment. I mean, and I hear what you're saying, you know, can we wean ourselves off oil? We're so dependent upon it. But I think that there's much more receptivity towards renewable energy now. You've got the climate change tomorrow, the big, you know, on the streets of people. I think things are changing, and it's slow and it's not fast enough. But I don't think we should give up hope. And we need a diversity of, you know, of all sorts of energy, actually.
Especially in Africa.
Especially in Africa.
And especially if it's not trickling down, right, Irene?
Exactly. You know, you could have, you know, you could do, in Nigeria, you could do investments in solar, all sorts of energy, you know, we need to be looking more at that sort of thing, and getting communities to understand that when they find oil, it's not going to get tripled, you know, they're not going to benefit from that. It will be the corporations and a few people.
Irene Gelak, thank you so much for joining us on Channel's Business Global. Very insightful. Well, coming up, for decades, black women in Britain have been the lowest paid members of the workforce, but that's no longer the case. We'll be speaking to one woman who's highlighting their achievements. See you after the break.